4. Phil? 341. Yeah, sorry. Transposed me numbers. I apologise.
Just worrying that I might be presenting a different report to one Thank you very much, Chair. So this is what it says on the tin. It's about city deal borrowing and the establishment of a new strategic investment fund across Greater Norwich. It is not referring to a specific borrowing agreement. There are references to Long Chat 5 plus that is a model. It is not a specific borrowing request. What this is doing is it's establishing a new recyclable fund across Greater Norwich, which needs effectively the agreement of all the respective Greater Norwich partners. So it is worth noting, so I'm speaking without microphone, it is worth noting that this is not exposing this council to any liability of borrowing at this point in time. And if there was a future project that this council was going to lead on, then that would come back as a separate report. So the key points, just to draw members' attention to it, is it's looking to agree the ability to draw down up to £20 million from PWB in order to allow the lead authority, whichever lead authority that is across Greater Norwich, to invest or lend that money to a specific project in their respective jurisdiction. The lead authority will secure those repayments, and those repayments will then establish a new strategic investment fund, as in the title of this paper. The repayments to PWLB will be taken from the shared pool fund. Too many acronyms, I know, but that's the Infrastructure Investment Fund. And because we are all contributing to that pooled fund, again, that's why this council needs to give its agreement to it. And recommendation 4 is that this council agrees that the Greater Norwich Growth Board will be have delegated authority to manage the allocation of the borrowing at the appropriate time. Chair, I'll leave it there, but I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Sue?
Thank you, Phil. Please just explain who are the Greater Norwich Growth Board, who sits on it? Thanks.
So the Greater Norwich Growth Board is made up of the partners, which are Norfolk County Council, Broadland District Council, South Norfolk and Norwich City Council, and the New Anglia LEP.
Okay. Jan, did I say?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, Phil. Okay, so I'm just trying to get my head around this.
Yep.
Okay. So you're establishing the Strategic Investment Fund because you can't do what you'd like to do with the IIF. Is that right?
I'd probably strike out the word because. So it's what we want to do is there is a pot of money that Treasury hold, £20 million, and we want to be able to, as a partnership, have access to that, draw it down, and then assign it to relevant projects, infrastructure projects in our respective areas. But we want to do that not just as grant funding, where we kiss goodbye to the money and we never see it again. We want to do it in a way that it funds developer contributions. They then repay it. Now, once they repay it, it could go back into the pooled SIL fund. But bear with me, because the pooled SIL fund has a set of regulations enshrined by the SIL, the Community Infrastructure Levy regulations, which restrict how we use that money. So there is a benefit in creating a new fund, the Strategic Investment Fund. And so what we'll see is, let's say there's £20 million in pooled SIL. As that goes down to repay the borrowing, we'll see the Strategic Investment Fund going up. And that will be less restricted in how we use that money. Does that make sense?
I absolutely follow that. And that's my issue. Okay.
Okay.
So what you're saying is that under the community infrastructure, the SIL, that it's restricted for community projects, right? That's why it's called community infrastructure. Yeah. And what you're saying is that actually what we want to do is broaden this out. I mean, the Public Works Loans Board, it is a loan, so it's not a grant. Okay, so it's not extra money coming in, but it's seeds that circulating.
Absolutely.
Okay. But then what you're doing is actually, in the paper here, is suggesting that within the city deal, the fund will be used to support infrastructure required to open up sites for housing or employment development. And in fact, the examples you've given are all roads, roads, and roads. And I appreciate those are examples, but they are roads. The NDR, Long Stratton bypass. So what we're doing here is taking money from communities that could benefit from that, putting it into a pot, which is then funded and then transferred ultimately into the Strategic Investment Fund, which builds roads. And I think that's the problem I have with this proposal. And
that's fine.
Is that right? Yeah, thanks.
No, it's not right. But I'm happy to explain that if you'd like me to respond to that point. Community infrastructure levy is used for multiple purposes, much of which goes to other things other than roads. In fact, I'd probably guess that the vast majority goes on other things apart from roads. The community infrastructure levy goes, but for example, yes, you said all the references I've used one reference for what this money could go on, which is the Long Stratton bypass, which has been a long-awaited piece of infrastructure. There will be other opportunities. For example, I know that Norwich City want to be able to facilitate the use of brownfield land at East Norwich using this fund in the same way. But I know that, I'll come back to it, I know that Norwich City would like to use this funding stream to enable the brownfield land, i.e. if we develop 4,000 homes on brownfield land, that's 4,000 homes we don't have to develop on greenfield land. And therefore, I would push back on your assertion that this will just be for roads.
One last question, then
Okay, if we can just
I've got Peter Bullman,
make
and
one
I've got
more
not
point.
Not one last question overall. I've got lots of people waiting.
Okay. So on page 349, we've got a list of issues and risks. And I'd suggest that under environmental impact, which is paragraph 11.4, we're missing out a few issues here, because of the examples that have been given, I suggest that there will be an adverse impact on the environment unless we tighten up on the objectives and the restrictions within this fund. I mean, it does say it'll be the responsibility of the lead authority to consider the environmental impacts of the scheme as part of the associated planning approval, but that's pretty weak. And I'm just flagging up the fact that what this does is to open up funding for projects which, at this particular moment in time, we really need to be a lot more discerning about where our funding goes, and not to impact the environment any more than we already are, and which is clearly, plainly happening as we see today.
Okay.
I could go on. I'm not going to.
I think, Peter Bullman, then I've got Sue Holland, and then Grant Nurden.
I'm just checking my understanding here, Phil. So basically, all we're being asked to agree to, or Cabinet is being asked to agree to be precise, is an enabling facility. You're not actually saying we're going to use it. You're not actually saying it's going to be earmarked for X, Y, and Z. You just think that sometime in the future, we could use funds like this for some particular purpose, and the particular purpose will come up later on when it's appropriate to do so. I trust you implicitly, Phil, of course. I just wanted to clarify that.
I'm reassured. That is correct.
And
it is correct that you trust me, and it's also your assertion was correct as well.
It's also going to council, so it's council approved rather than just for cabinet. So it's cabinet recommend to council. Sue.
Yes, thank you. Mine was for clarification as well, but it was basically, and I think you've really answered all the questions. Essentially, you're allowing people to borrow that money to do something, and they will be paying it back in S106 agreements as still money. Yes,
it is, and the reason, as I say, to reiterate the point, because it's pooled SIL, and we are effectively authorising pooled SIL to be used for those repayments. Then that is why each of the partners needs to agree it, and the creation of the Strategic Investment Fund also, because that will be a decision that we will effectively pool that funding, which is why, again, that's being sought for approval. That is correct.
Grant?
Thank you, Chairman. Phil, thank you. My question is probably just a little bit of clarity. You mentioned that there's 4 partners in this Greater Norwich Growth Board, one of them 5, one of them being the LEP. Why? Because it's the other 4 provide infrastructure. What is the LEP going to? What's their involvement, and why are they going to be committing themselves to this as well? That just needs a bit of clarity for me. Thank you.
Yeah, that's fine. No, I mean, they are committing themselves to this because they are one of the 5 partners of the Greater Norwich Growth Board. And if you remember, even at the outset of the city deals and at that period of time, I know perhaps we are in a slightly different political environment as far as the LEP is concerned, but certainly at that time, they were the conduit for all infrastructure funding. All investment in this area was effectively coming through the LEP. And for that growth board, it was crucial that the LEP was on that board.
Sue?
Thank you, Chair. So we borrow money as Broadland and then put it in a pot with others, and then that board decides how to spend it. But won't there be interest to be paid by Broadland? And what does Broadland get out of it?
No, that's not quite correct. So just bear with me again, because I appreciate it is somewhat complicated. So there's £20 million sitting at Treasury, which we have access to. And when I say we, I am talking about the Greater Norwich Growth Board as a collective. So we as a partnership can draw down up to £20 million from Treasury for specific projects. Okay, does that make sense? First of all, you're looking confused at that point.
Just a question. Could Broadland borrow some anyway?
So Broadland, if it so wished, could go off and borrow some money anyway from PWB, PWLB, or any other body. But the fact is that there is money that is very cheap, that is sitting with Treasury, that Broadland and the other Greater Norwich partners could have access to if they so wished. So if there is more expensive money to borrow elsewhere, why would we borrow it from elsewhere rather than through this facility? You're still looking confused, Councillor Catchpole.
Not confused, just wondering why would Broadland need to borrow money when we have reserves?
Because let's say if we wanted to expedite the delivery of somewhere like Beeston Park by delivering upfront key infrastructure for that and investing in that infrastructure, because that's been a stalled site for a long period of time. We want to see that growth, notwithstanding I appreciate some of the views around this room, but as a council, we have signed up to that growth agenda. There is an outline planning permission for Beeston Park for 3,500 homes, and there will be a lot of upfront costs. So if we wanted to expedite that by delivering some community infrastructure or other forms of infrastructure, then we would look to borrow that money rather than simply use our reserves. Having said that, that would always be a choice that this council could have. If it wanted to use its own reserves, then it could. But this is still a borrowing facility that is there. But I do go back to the point of this report. It is not about a specific project. It is about establishing the facility. It's about establishing the structure to be able to borrow that money if Broadland so wish to do in the future, or any other Greater Norwich partner wish to do in the future.
Okay. Steve?
Thank you. Yeah, and the borrowing on that, I think it's 1.5%.
It is so it's 0.4% under the Public Works Loan Board figures. Now they publish their figures twice a day, but it's around about, it's either side of 3% at the moment. So it's 4% below the PWLB borrowing rate.
So you could get down as low as 1 or 1.5%. Yeah, exactly. And of course, the issue, if we did have a project, council, which come through to full council, whatever, then the revenue budget needs to be in place to be able to pay back the loan over how many years the loan gets paid back. Therefore, that if that's all within revenue budget and the cabinet have done their job properly, then of course it's all fiscally acceptable to one finance officer, and the appropriate measures would be in place. Phil, I'm asking the question. Yeah. So a scrutiny question: would the appropriate measures be in place in that instance?
Absolutely, and that would be going through this same committee process, and would be given the rigour that you'd normally give it.
Okay, thank you.
Ken?
My question's answered. On the question of the interest rate, which I think you said would be about 1.5%.
It'd be
0.4.
0.04% below the PWLB borrowing rate at that time of borrowing, which is in the region at the moment. PWLB borrowing, depending on the length of time and all the rest, is about either side of 3%.
So I was like 3%.
So you then take, so it's going to be closer to about 2.5% as the figures are today.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Consistently sorry, Chair. Consistently, if you look at the long term, it's actually been lower.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm giving today's figures.
Sue, one last question.
Sorry, just need to try and keep this simple. So if Broadland borrowed money from that same source, would they get the same rate as joining these councils together in partnership and then borrowing more? Or are they offering a better rate because
This is a special rate that would be lower than Broadland is likely to secure in any other way.
Is that the motivation for doing this for Broadland?
Yeah.
Sorry, I know you work for both South Norfolk and Broadland.
No,
we represent
it's not the case. It's not, I've presented the same paper effectively to South Norfolk. That's not the issue. This is about, we are, and over the last 10 years, our role as a council, I would argue, has evolved and changed, and we have become far more proactive at delivering and doing things. Whether that's something like, the Broadland Food Innovation Centre, we have proactively intervened to facilitate and enable growth to happen. That takes money, and it is important that we have access to money if we need it in the future. This is simply providing the structure and the framework for us if we choose to draw down money. In the meantime, I have no doubt, because it's even in the report, that South Norfolk will choose to draw down money to facilitate the delivery of Long Stratton Bypass. Now, we are a Greater Norwich partnership, and the delivery of Long Stratton Bypass, even though it's not in Broadland, is just as important to the Greater Norwich area as it is just to South Norfolk. So as a partner of the Greater Norwich Growth Board, it is again important for us to establish this facility, even to deliver infrastructure in South Norfolk, and it may well present us with an opportunity in the future to deliver infrastructure to help facilitate growth in Broadland as well.
Sorry, just a supplementary question, because you didn't answer it. What is it going to cost Broadland?
Ultimately, it won't cost Broadland anything, because this is enabling a recyclable fund. So the repayments arising from any borrowing that we draw down to facilitate infrastructure, to help a developer to deliver quicker, those repayments will then come from a developer back to us and back into the Greater Norwich Partnership. So ultimately, there is no cost of this structure to Broadland District Council. That's why it's a recyclable fund.
It's recyclable and enabling. So it's
recyclable.
just really to fetch stuff forward. And
But
then
I'm sorry, I've just got to zoom down on this. So how does it appear in Broadland's accounts? We can't agree to an organisation that we are part of borrowing money without having some liability for it, surely?
Will you just bear with me if I just give a very quick analogy, okay? Imagine, I was going to say, imagine you are my child. Let's say let's say my son comes to me and says, I want to buy a house. And it's not unusual now for a parent to effectively facilitate that borrowing for a child. I go to the bank and I borrow money on behalf of my child. It enables them to buy a house. The repayments come from that child back to me and back ultimately to the bank. I am not losing any money because my child is effectively repaying and they are using me as a conduit for that. This is a very similar scheme where we are facilitating a developer to bring forward infrastructure and their development, and we are acting as a conduit through that. So is there any cost? Ultimately, so that, yes, there would be some liability and some risk, but it goes back to Councillor Riley's point that at the point of Broadland, if it chose to enter into an agreement, would have to go through the rigour, due diligence and robustness of governance to make sure that that risk is mitigated.
What happens if the developer goes bust?
Well, that comes back to there is some liability and risk. But I come back to the point, this report is not seeking that authorisation. It is setting up the establishment of a structure and a fund that would enable us to borrow if we so wished. The risk and liability would have to be considered at the time that we enter into that project if we so wished.
Yeah. It's just this is just the structure. It's not the other thing. So I think anything else, because anything else would come through ONS and then through cabinet and then full council. So if there are no more questions, can I take us to the recommendations on page 350? We have it's proposed that the cabinet recommends to council. So this is for us to recommend. Is everybody happy with the recommendations? Show of hands.
1, 2, 3, 5, 9. 9 for.
Against?
1 against.
Abstain?
2
2.
abstentions.
Thank you, Phil.
Thank you.
So we'll move on to
Thank you very
the
much, Councillor.
enforcement policy on page 390.
Excuse me, Martin. I'm going to have to leave at this point now.
Okay, thank you.
Chair, as I've already.
Okay, thank you.
Apology to the officers, but I already had a meeting booked for tonight, so. You leave.
Hey, Nick, can you, if you
Burnt down house or something.
thank you. So Andrew should be presenting, but we have your pleasure.
Chair, thank you very much, and apologies. Andrew Grimley, who was the author of the covering report, is not available today at work, and therefore I'm presenting in his stead. More words from me, I'm afraid.
Sorry, we're on page 390. 390.
390. Chair, thank you very much. So this report starts on gender, page 390. There is an appendix at page 396, and that's the existing enforcement policy. And at appendix 2, on page 422 of your papers, is the proposed enforcement policy, which has been reviewed. So this report presents an overarching enforcement policy for adoption, and that's to replace the existing enforcement policy, which was last produced and revised in 2015. In proposing and bringing forward a new enforcement policy, we've considered a range of other local authority policies where they're published, and we have sought to bring the best practice from each of those in, alongside a number of identifiable non-local authority enforcement agencies. Some considerations in what you see in Appendix 2 have been refreshed and updated, but several are new, such as, for example, considerations about enforcement that involves vulnerable people, or enforcement that involves minors. The policy here establishes an overarching approach, the context, the general considerations, but to be taken by the council's officers. It addresses key expectations and requirements that are placed on all the enforcement agencies in England and Wales. I won't say too much more because you'll find that in the report, except to say that underneath this overarching enforcement policy, there will be a range of service-specific enforcement policies. They contain a huge amount of technical detail that you wouldn't expect to see in the overarching policy. It allows the both to exist side by side. Just to give one example, in food safety, the National Food Standards Agency has got some very close and exacting requirements about how enforcement work is carried out, and you would expect those to be in a service-specific enforcement policy. That's the distinction between the two. Today we bring you the overarching one. So the last thing perhaps for me to say in introduction, Chair, is that the officers who've developed the overarching policy have done so on the basis of bringing forward something that is compatible and can work at both Broadland and at South Norfolk councils in having a common wording. Clearly, two sovereign councils and two sovereign policies. But if the wording of those enforcement policies is compatible, then the officers will be left with no uncertainty, confusion, working across the range of both Broadland and South Norfolk. I think, Chair, I'll bring that to a close, except to say that the recommendation in the report is that Cabinet to recommend to Council to agree the adoption of the proposed overarching enforcement policy at Appendix 2, to replace the existing overarching enforcement policy, retaining its other existing thematic enforcement policies. Thank you.
There was also an amended option 2 on there to delegate to the Assistant Director of Regulatory, in consultation with the portfolio holder for environmental excellence, to enact any amendments advised by the legal team following the completion of the review.
Chair, thank you. So legal advice has been sought on the enforcement policy. We're awaiting the finalisation and the final comments back from our legal support. This document is based on a format that's been used elsewhere and therefore it's been scrutinised before, but there is the potential for minor tweaks or wording changes to be proposed by legal services. That's the reason for the second recommendation.
That's fine. So if there was a substantive change, though, that would come forward differently to this.
Absolutely. If anything goes to the heart of the policy, we would expect to bring that back to members.
Yeah. Okay, any questions? Peter?
It's more of a comment, really. I don't have an issue with the report, but when you have a document which replaces another document, it would be extremely helpful if the key issues in differences were highlighted, rather than having to search through and see which is which and what is what. It's just easier.
Yeah, a marked up document of track changes or something. Yeah. Okay. Anybody, any questions on the policy or the recommendation? Sue?
So just that clarification then, there is nothing major that's changed. Most of this is to do with regulation that may have changed and simply wording to make it clearer where those things go. You see what I mean?
Yes, that is correct. The changes that have been made have been to ensure transparency, to give public certainty and confidence, to update along the lines of the Regulators Code, but anything else that's commensurate and has changed since our last revision. So to provide that clarity, make sure the officers have got certainty of confidence of how they carry out their enforcement, and to anticipate and support the Council's decisions going forward. So no major changes there.
Grant?
Thank you, Chairman. Just a quick question, Nick. Any changes from what was presented to the Environment Excellence Panel to the report that we've got tonight? I didn't see any changes, but are there?
Yes, the Environmental Excellence Policy Development Panel met on the 23rd of June and considered this, and there was a range of questions, and commensurate changes have been built into the report. So there were a number of areas. There were references, for example, to the treatment of vulnerable people, and there was some clarifications requested in certain areas where the wording was felt to be a bit clumsy. We had referenced the lists of service enforcement policies in several places, and that was felt confusing, and that's been brought forward to the top of the document, for example. And we've updated considerations about publicity and publicising of enforcement decisions, which was a key area of conversation for the Policy Development Panel.
Okay. Sue Holland?
Thank you, Chair. We receive a monthly-ish report of the various parishes and any planning enforcement issues. But there still seems to be a lot of delay on follow-up with some of those. And I'm wondering if there's anything in this review of the policy that would help to speed that up, or is that purely a staffing issue that things just can't move forward more quickly with the enforcement of planning problems?
I can't speak for the detail of planning enforcement, which sits with a fellow assistant director. What I can say is that the planning enforcement arrangements have been reviewed, they have been updated, and the planning enforcement policy exists and sits as a fairly fresh policy underneath this overarching policy. So that would be a separate matter to the overarching policy that you have before you, but I'm afraid I don't have an answer to your specific question today.
Okay, thank you. So if we take you to page 395, but there's obviously the recommendation 1 and the recommendation 2. Do you want me to read the second recommendation out again, or are we happy? Okay, so all those in favour of the recommendation? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Move to agenda item 14, the Economic Growth Strategic Plan, page 422. We've got page 422. That's Deborah and Ella. But not quite Deborah.
Not quite, Deborah and George. But
Deborah
yes.
and George. Thank you, George.
So the strategic plan summary you've got in front of you has been developed to outline the activities and the priorities that the economic growth team will be undertaking to deliver against the council's strategic and delivery plans. To produce this plan, we've worked with a large number of stakeholders across Broadland, South Norfolk, Norfolk and into Suffolk as well. We've worked closely with the Economic Success Policy Development Panel, which is the paper's been taken to them a few times to get to this final iteration. So behind the summary document is a larger plan which will be continuously redeveloped. It will be brought back to members through the performance management system. So what we're asking you for today is approval to use the summary document as an external facing document. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? No? Everybody happy with the strategic plan? Fantastic. Thank you. Can we, I'll move you then to the recommendation, which is on 425. Cabinet recommends Council approval and adopt the Economic Growth Strategic Plan. All those in favour?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
That's like 8.
8 against.
That's 8 and 2 against.
8 and 2 against. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry.
2 against.
Thank you very much. So next move to agenda item 15, the Shared Prosperity Fund Investment Plan, page 442, Ken.
Okay, that's me again.
You're going to...
So Broadland's been allocated just over £1.31 million of shared prosperity fund. So this covers the 3 years starting April just gone, April 2022. But in order to be able to access this funding, we had to submit an investment plan by the 1st of August this year. So the report in front of you outlines the 3 work streams we're proposing. They are existing work streams, so we're building on these, using this additional funding to maximise the benefit of both existing and this shared prosperity fund as well. To support communities in place, we're proposing that expanding the Pride in Place programme. So this will be working with community groups, local town and parish councils to create and develop safe and healthy neighbourhoods, whilst improving community infrastructure and amenities available within communities themselves. As part of the business support pillar, we're proposing working with key sector groups. The evidence base behind this is from the strategic plan we just agreed. So we'll be using the Cambridge-Norwich Tech Corridor as the main function, working with the sector groups to encourage research and innovation along the corridor and across Broadland itself. So the final funding stream is to support skills and training. This funding has restrictions on it and can only be used from 2024 onwards. And we're proposing using this funding to create higher skilled employment across the district, working with businesses to encourage the uptake of apprenticeships and placements within them. Happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you. So, does anybody have any questions on the report? No, everyone happy with that? So, if we
This is for the Broadland area. This particular
yes, it is.
funding
Yes,
that
it's
you're talking about.
1.3 million.
Yes, I think you
pounds.
said 1.3. Thank you. I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah. I think it's split in the table on table 3.1 is between the revenue and the
Yes.
everything else.
Thank you.
Okay, so sorry, Grant, I missed you. Apologies.
It's just an afterthought. You say it's Broadland, but I'm a business in Broadland, and I've been approached by Norfolk County to provide me with money to train staff. So it seems like everybody's throwing money at businesses for skills development and training. But surely it should be centralized rather than each council and the overarching council, and then I don't know, maybe even at a higher level that they're all throwing money at. So why are we doing it and not county doing it?
That's an excellent question. This field is excuse me. This field's quite complicated and it's full of providers offering lots of different things. What we want to do is to take some control over this space, and that's why we're proposing to have our own scheme in 24-25. Lots of these employment, skills and apprenticeship programs are funded by European Union funding, which is one of the reasons that the UK SPF funding can't be used until 24-25, which is when most of that funding and programs expire. What we'd like to do is to take control of our own destiny and support the local businesses to get the skilled jobs that they need, and our residents to be upskilled to get the jobs that they would like to have. So I agree, this area is complex and potentially confusing for the customer. What we want to do is to provide our own solution to that so that there's some clarity for everybody.
Good. Jan?
Yeah, just a point of clarification. I mean, it looks, potentially, I mean, you do mention town and parish councils as well. And I suppose, the district council working with the town and parish councils would be a way in which local infrastructure can be supported. I'm just wondering how far that would go in terms, and whether there would be what kind of support in terms of guidance and so on, because I assume that would be a kind of match funding type situation. And so if town and parish councils needed to, I'm thinking the smaller parish councils in particular, would need to look for that match funding, whether there would be that support as part of this programme.
Thank you for the question. In response, this programme is going to evolve over 3 years. So it's a 3-year investment plan. We're making commitments around themes and outputs, but that's likely to adopt and evolve as we go over the 3 years. What both councils have already done is to commit to employing a manager responsible for relationships with towns and parishes. What we really want to do is for the solutions to come from towns and parishes, so we can be directed to supporting them in their need. Broadland District Council already has a borrowing facility for community infrastructure, so we already loan the money up front to towns and parishes if they want to deliver community infrastructure. But it's not just about money, it's often about support, guidance and hand-holding through the development of business cases, through the planning process and other associated activities, whether that's dealing with contractors. We see that this role will evolve over those 3 years. So we have some funding set aside to support community infrastructure we're proposing at this stage, and that complements already existing funds. But the key to this will be around support and specific officer guidance, because we've got a team of experts here at the council that can offer that kind of support.
Fantastic. Sue?
Thank you, Chair. Just to ask whether it's already built into this or whether it will be, to monitor where the money is going across the district, because obviously being out on a limb up in Aylsham, we'd be quite concerned that every part of Broadland should perhaps benefit to a similar level rather than it will be focusing one or two areas. Thank you.
The challenge here is that we're quite keen for this funding to make a difference where it's spent. And the thing about economics is that if an area benefits from economic growth, it benefits the wider demographic and wider area. I can't commit that all areas of Broadland will receive funding from these pots because the funding is actually quite limited for the programmes that we're proposing. And it doesn't give us certainty beyond years 1 to 3. What we can commit to is making a difference. So there are a number of outputs that we have to commit to as part of the funding that will be tracked, measured, and we have to submit that back to central government. So although we can't promise everybody will get a slice of the pie, what we want to do is to make the biggest difference with the money that we have available.
Sorry, just to follow up then. So are those criteria already set, or is that something that's going to evolve as well? How you decide which projects are actually going to make the biggest difference?
Good question. And it depends on the work stream. So we've got 3 work streams there. I see, and this will evolve over time, that the people and place interventions around towns and parishes, that will be based on need and the conversations that are occurring between the relationship manager in those towns and parishes. The business intervention will be more straightforward, and then we're looking to develop clusters. Those clusters will support wider supply chains and other industries associated with those clusters. And then in the final year around the business support, we've got 2 years to prepare and understand what the skill shortages are for our local businesses and employers. So that's the general intention. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. If there are no more questions, I'll direct you to page 451, the recommendation Cabinet to approve in section 6. Yeah, 451, and there's a little is 6.1 to 6.4 and then 6.5 on the following page. All those who are in favour? That's unanimous. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'll move to agenda item 16 on page 454. You're staying with us, George. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. The purpose of this report seeks Cabinet's endorsement for the delivery of a suite of interventions to complement our business support offer, enabled by the Norfolk Strategic Fund, NSF. And it's to request authority to be delegated to the Assistant Director for Economic Growth in consultation with the portfolio holder for economic growth to use the grant monies in support of the Business Builder programme outlined below. And the recommendations are that Cabinet endorses the proposed revised programme of activity to be funded from the NSF grant, and Cabinet agrees to delegate the authority to the Assistant Director of Economic Growth in consultation with the portfolio holder for economic development to determine the use of the balance of the grant monies in accordance with the programme detailed in the report. And thirdly, that Cabinet agrees to officers submitting a variation request to the Norfolk Strategic Fund for the programme of work detailed in this report. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. So, any questions? Peter?
How will we know what this money is actually going to be used for? We seem to be giving, dare I say it, a blank check.
The grant programme is split into various different areas of support depending on the life cycle of a business, and the grants will be given according to the demand. So we'll have several windows of we'll open and close windows of opportunity, and we'll assess the need, and all of the outcomes are being tracked in the milestones to be reported to the Norfolk Strategic Fund. And
So-
there
so
is
will-
criteria in the report which determines the eligibility.
I understand that, but will members actually see sight of these particular developments, or are we just giving a blanket coverage?
Do you mean, are you asking, will members be involved in the actual decision-making process?
Well, will we actually see where this money's going to exactly? Or are we just giving you the mandate to say, here's a sum of money to be spent on these broadly identified areas? Will we see the specific projects?
Yeah, so it's in a way it's quite similar to the enterprise grants that are currently and have been operated in Broadland for a number of years, in that businesses will approach us and we are going to be marketing this program, and we will then work with that business, and in a contributory fashion, with match funding, we will work with them on the demands and the needs of each individual business. So you're asking, will you see it? Yes, you will. You'll see the growth of the individual investment.
To be frank, I still don't think you've answered the question. So I won't see project X is being funded by Y.
What you will see, and what we've committed to as part of this report, and this is a refresh of a cabinet paper that went to cabinet last July. What we're committed to this time is a number of outputs. So although we won't bring back every example where we provided funding, because some of these pots of funding are quite small, deliberately so, because the intention is to get those businesses to contribute as well. What we will do, what we are doing, is committing to some project outcomes. And those are, for example, number of entrepreneurs supported through startup grants, and we're going to record how many entrepreneurs we've supported. We've got number of new business startups, so that will be a change in the number of new business startups. The number of young entrepreneurs starting up businesses, which is exciting. The number of new businesses receiving mentoring support, and again, that has other. But what we will do in time, is incorporate that as part of the performance management we have at the council in the delivery plan going forwards. Is that okay?
And it is also outlined in table 2, isn't it? So how each individual pot of money is being allocated. Yeah. Jan?
Yeah, I asked a similar sort of question at the Economic Success Policy Panel, and you know, we did discuss it to a point, but I think I'd just like to reiterate. I think we need to be able to, and I'm not sure how it does connect. We talked about the Economic Strategic Growth Plan, and I did vote against that, and there was a reason for that. I mean, the second key objective, I think, was clean growth. Yep. But if that's part of the strategy, then we need to build that into everything then we do in terms of economic development, business development, and so on. So I would suggest, therefore, that there are certain criteria. I know you've got the eligibility criteria, which is eligibility, but it's what we actually then invest in as a council to achieve the objectives of the Economic Growth Strategic Plan, which is clean growth. It's there. So when I asked about, well, you know, would we build in issues such as assessing, you know, carbon emissions, energy consumption, and that sort of thing, it was felt that, well, that would be too restrictive on the businesses. Actually, I think that would be very helpful for businesses because they would want to reduce their energy bills. And I would hope they would want to reduce their carbon emissions as well. And if possible, add to biodiversity. And all those issues that are there mentioned in both our environmental strategy and our economic growth strategic plan. And it tends to be too much of the rhetoric and not then transferring into the action, which is, you know, could be achieved through this business builder. And so I feel it's a shame. I mean, I want to support it, you know, because I think we need to support small businesses and people getting off the ground and so on. But there's something missing here. And that is a consistent, you know, in terms of how we transfer that strategy and the overall policy into actual action on the ground. So you can say number of entrepreneurs supported, number of young entrepreneurs, number of new businesses, but what are they doing? I mean, if somebody came along and said, I want to start up a mini coal-fired power station, you know, in Broadland, how would you assess that? And presumably you'd say, well, that's not feasible or not good for the for Broadland. So you already have ideas in your mind, but they're not actually there and agreed upon within the council. And I think that would be useful.
Is some of that not covered under 6.4 under the environmental impact, where it's actually talking about how the officers are going to encourage and support businesses in the green agenda?
Yeah. And so we did discuss that as well, and that's where I was thinking that actually we can build on that, and strengthen exactly what. So, these might include, it says, and not limited to. But actually, if you are implementing a clean growth strategy, which is there in the economic strategic plan, then you want to be more positive about that and say, well, we will support this, but we won't support, a mini coal-fired power station or whatever it might be. Obviously, I've chosen an extreme example.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I just make a comment? Whilst I agree entirely with the basics of what you're saying, the Norfolk Strategic Fund is set up, and the purpose behind this, the original application, is to reinvigorate the high street. And at the minute, if we are overly prescriptive on our criteria, we could be destroying the very thing we're trying to encourage. That's why I think the whole point of this is to take it into account. The mentoring is to help businesses to look at their green agendas, look at their carbon emissions, and minimize any carbon footprint they might have. But I think it would be overly prescriptive if we only supported green projects.
I'm just saying that it could be, a lot tighter in the sense that, I can think of one or two, high street schemes where we've had issues in terms of, it might be very small issues, but they are issues.
I just think it unlikely that 750 quid's going to do much to start a coal-fired power station, but I do take your point.
I mean, extreme, but it's the principle, what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
And it's building that principle into the business builder and many other activities that Broadland take on and support. Thanks.
Okay, any other questions? No? Okay, I'll take us to the recommendations on page 463. All in favour? Carried. Thank you. I'll take us to agenda item 18, the exclusion of the press and public. I move that the press and public be excluded from the meeting for the remaining items of business because otherwise information which is exempt information by virtue of paragraph 3 of part 1 of schedule 12A of the Local Government Act 1972 as amended by the Local Government Access to Information Variation Order 2006 would be disclosed to them.